Rich people get richer. And so it is ideal. You just keep their money with you until either someone else steals them away by maybe by offering them cocaine or what have you, I don't know, or until they die, in which case you hope to get their heirs as customers.
Welcome to Blitzscaling Yourself. I'm Julien Newman, serial entrepreneur, and working on my next business with the help of Chris Ye. Chris is one of the world's most famous investors. He runs his own fund, but he's mostly known for being the co-author of the book Blitzscaling, which he co-authored with Reid, the founder of LinkedIn. The foreword of Chris's book was written by Bill Gates. It's taught at Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and everywhere. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Julien. It's always great to see you.
And I am at a stage in my startup where I'm learning about problems and discovering problems of potential users and customers. And one of the question marks in my mind was, to what extent do I need to care about the problems of various stakeholders? And your recommendation is you need to have a primary purpose for your product. You have to have a primary audience, and that audience needs to be powerful, monetizable, and highly motivated. And the other groups matter, but less.
They're nice to have rather than must have. Yeah,
So,
no, you've summarized it well. And this is because we are engaged in entrepreneurship. We are trying to bring something new into the world. And the fact is, human beings are lazy and don't like to change. And so you have to strongly motivate them to try anything new. And you cannot get there with a bunch of, yeah, that would be kind of nices. You have to have a, oh my God, I need this problem fixed now. Or, oh my God, I want that so badly. And so that's why when we're dealing with one of these hidden marketplaces, as James Courier from NFX would say, you have to find a hidden marketplace where at least one side of the marketplace is, as you put it, rich, powerful, monetizable, and highly motivated. They're the primary driver of the marketplace. They're the reason why everyone else comes there. And of course, the other components of the marketplace, the other parties, it's nice if they have a good experience. It's nice if they're motivated. But at the end of the day, what really matters is that primary driver.
so we'll start with an example that's an actual marketplace, and then we'll talk about a SaaS business, which is kind of a little bit less obvious that there are multiple sides. So let's start with Uber, where you have a two-sided marketplace, the riders and the drivers. And early on in the Uber journey, the drivers, who are definitely very important, they're kind of the hard side of the market for Uber. They're motivated to solve the problem. It's good for them, but they weren't the ones who had this like burning need to solve something. It was the riders, like me and you, and the fact that riders are super motivated, that is what mattered.
Absolutely. So if you think about the riders in the ride-hailing system, they are the people who needed to get somewhere. And you and I are old enough to remember the days when you had to use taxi cabs. There was no Uber, there was no Lyft, there were just taxi cabs. And it was absolutely horrendous. I would primarily only take them to get to and from the airport. It was almost impossible to get them to go to the airport because if you wanted a taxi cab, you would call a dispatching service. And meanwhile, what would happen on the back end is there would be a dispatcher and be talking on the radio saying, anyone around? And they would give you no feedback and you would have no idea if anyone would ever arrive. And you would just call again. They would say, okay, well, let's send it out again. And eventually, if you're lucky, somebody arrived and the taxi cab was old and dirty and nasty, and the driver might or might not know how the hell to get to the airport. And when you got to the airport, you would have to tip them, and it would probably cost too much. You weren't sure if you were being ripped off or not, and you had to make sure you got cash in advance. All of this was horrendous. And yet, despite this being one of the most unpleasant experiences in people's lives, we had a $100 billion a year global taxi market, which just goes to show you that the need was there. And so when ride hailing came about, the idea was, well, let's tap into that $100 multi-billion-dollar market of people who are pretty motivated. Because guess what? What are the alternatives that we had to taxi cabs that were even worse? Well, we could go drive our car to the airport, park, and pay a lot of money, or park it off airport parking and take a shuttle, or get a friend to drop us off, but then we'd have to get them to pick us up. All these alternatives are so wretchedly bad. Let's not even get into taking a bus from the airport back to wherever you were, that people still took cabs, even though cabs were horrendous. And so that clearly identified itself as a wonderful opportunity. Here's a hugely valuable market where the product is atrociously bad and every user hates it, and yet they spend the money anyways. And so in building out Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing services, what you needed was to be able to serve the needs of that traveler. Now, in order to serve the needs of that traveler, they had to start with the drivers, because you need a large enough pool of drivers to confer sufficient liquidity. If a person got Uber and summoned a ride and they didn't get a ride for half an hour, they'd say, F this is even worse than a taxi cab. So what Uber did was to use the power of money and get drivers to just be paid to sit around and do nothing, and so that they could actually go and pick people up. And they subsidized the rides, so the drivers were being paid far more than the riders were paying, so that the riders would develop the habit of using the Uber. And that's because, again, it's hard to get people to try anything new. The first time you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to get into a stranger's car. Maybe he's a killer. Maybe he's going to drop me off in the middle of nowhere and kill me and bury me in the desert. Oh, it's that much cheaper? Okay, I'll try. And so by using the power of money, Uber was able to overcome the lack of motivation on the part of the drivers and the lack of motivation on the part of the riders. And ultimately, once people start having an experience with this and realize, hey, this is much better and it works, and I wasn't killed and dropped off in the desert, all of a sudden it becomes one of the world's big businesses. So that's a great example of you identify an audience that has money, travelers, primarily business travelers, but also non-business travelers that are highly motivated. They're currently being served by a terrible competitor. And then what you do is you make sure that you get the other parts of the marketplace on board. But the driver experience, I mean, I've never met drivers who are like, oh my God, I love Uber. And say, like, those bastards at Uber are screwing me over again. But it doesn't matter. They don't have an alternative. And they're not the ones who matter. The people who are providing the money, the riders, are the ones that matter.
And if I was doing research, circa 2011, I don't know when Uber started. I don't know if I remember, but
2008, 2009, I think.
So if I was doing research for, Uber, what I would discover is this really, really burning problem, like an actual pain point for the riders. And that would really pique my interest. And then I would investigate, I'd use that to come up with like possible solutions. And then I'd investigate the problems and the motivations of these other stakeholders. And definitely it's good that, the driver is being paid money and blah, blah. But fundamentally, what matters to me is, are there a lot of taxi or potential Uber riders? Do they really, really, really care? And how much are these people worth? So let's say in my case, I spent north of $10,000 a year on taxis at the time. And if you have a bunch of people like me, and you add them up, like that, you can do a kind of a calculation of like how many people are there, how monetizable are they, and are they actually going to do it? And that would be the thing that matters. The riders secondarily.
The drivers
secondarily. The drivers secondarily.
Just to issue that minor correction, but yes, exactly. Because with the drivers, you can solve that problem with enough money. And the way to think about this is think about it as an ecosystem. If we think about the ecosystems on the planet Earth, almost all of them are ultimately driven by solar energy. That is the source of energy that powers life on Earth. There's some very few that rely on, extremophiles and ocean vents and things like that. But 99.999999999% is solar power. And so it's all just about how does that solar power get taken in, stored, allocated in order to power this particular ecosystem. In the case of the ride hailing ecosystem, it is the money coming from the riders. That is the sunlight. And then the question is, how does that get apportioned out among the various players, including the drivers and the company itself and any enablers along the way? And does that equation work? But without that original sunlight, none of it matters.
The other example that's useful here is Salesforce or CRM companies, where you know you can think of them as having, being a two-sided marketplace between salespeople and chief financial officers or chief revenue officers or sales leaders, where the leadership, they need the reports. They need to know what's going on. They need to know if they're go out of business in 6 months or not. The salespeople, who actually are the most important part of the operation in terms of using these CRMs, they don't truly have a need. But because you have these really powerful people in the organization, the CFO, who has all the money and who will spend infinite amounts so as to know whether he's going to go out of business or not, his money, power, and you just add up all the CFOs, they can force the salespeople to do whatever.
Yes. So this is a fascinating case study because what it reveals is who you choose to serve makes a huge difference in terms of value. So prior to CRM, there actually were a set of companies that catered to the needs of the salespeople. And this was contact management software, the two leading pieces of software there being Act and Goldmine. And this was software that an individual salesperson would buy and use to keep track of their various contacts, basically a very sophisticated version of Microsoft Outlook contacts or your phone address book or something like that. And they would keep down information on the ages of the children and the name of the dog and all that kind of stuff. And this was the more organized electronic version of the old-fashioned Rolodex, which is a physical piece of equipment that you would put business cards into so you could keep track of all the people that you knew. And these were all sold to the individual salespeople because that's who was using it. Individual salespeople would use it to stay in touch with the people they knew, and they would use it as they went from company to company, each time bringing along their list of potential customers or leads or loyal followers or what have you. And these companies were successful enough, like people actually made money starting these companies and running them. They may even have IPO'd, but they were minuscule in comparison to the CRM companies that later came, like Siebel Systems and Salesforce.com. And that's because they were catering to the salespeople. First of all, the salespeople had a much lower willingness to pay. Only the salespeople who were the most organized and technically adept would actually use such software. And that was a tiny, tiny fraction of the salespeople. Because as you know, the majority of salespeople are not particularly technically proficient, generally pretty lazy, and often unintelligent. And so they were not a good fit for selling software. In the brilliance of CRM is they're like, okay, here we have a group of people, chief revenue officers, VPs of sales, people who really care and have control over huge amounts of budget. And what they can do is instead of us trying to convince a tiny fraction of salespeople to spend a small amount of money on software, why don't we just go ahead and convince the senior managers to mandate usage of CRM for every single salesperson, and let's charge them on a per salesperson basis. And oh, by the way, let's charge them far more than the contact managers could ever charge the individual salespeople, because the individual salespeople aren't capable of capital purchases, but companies certainly are. And so that's why CRM is so much bigger than contact management. It's because it's a different set of customers who are buying a different thing. Salespeople were buying effectiveness. CROs and VPs of sales are buying transparency, visibility, control.
So one of the elements here that is, requires kind of further digging into is the concept of monetizability. Mm-hmm. And there's timing of the monetizability, and there's a directness of the monetizability. So obviously you would rather be able to immediately directly make a lot of money from each of your users. But that's not always the case. And so we can take Facebook as an example, where they don't directly make money from the people who have the problem, right? Like the Facebook users are not paying. Also, it took like their early users, they couldn't make money off of them until they got to a critical mass.
Right.
So how should people think about, or how should I think about timing and directness of the monetizability?
Well, I'm going to add even a third axis because I think there's a question of the sustainability of the monetization over time that should also be considered. So if you look at these axes, obviously what you want is you want a monetization scheme where you can monetize as directly as possible, i.e., just have them give you money, or even better yet, just take it out of their pocket without them even having to lift a finger. You want it to be as soon as possible, preferably yesterday, but we'll settle for today, where you're getting the money upfront and as quickly as possible. And then you want sustainable over time so you can keep taking that money out over and over and over and over again. And all three of those together are really, really desirable. But it's rare that you're going to be able to get them all. If you were to think about it, what are cases in which you can actually come close to getting them all? Well, the best example would be something like wealth management, where you charge people a percentage of their assets. So it's automatically being just pulled out of their account. You have direct access. It's happening immediately. You pull money every quarter, and it's sustainable over time because as long as they stick with you, you can just keep taking their money. So that's why a wealth management customer is so valuable, and which is why wealth management companies will spend colossal amounts of money to acquire their customers. I happen to speak with the JP Morgan Chase folks. They're private banking folks. They do a ton of sponsorship of various events. They'll pay for just about anything. They're spending money like water. But why? Their clients have a minimum of $10 million in investable assets, and they're collecting at least 1% of that a year. Well, that's $100,000 a year. You can acquire, and that's at the minimum. You can spend a lot of money on customer acquisition if your customers are worth $100,000 a year and up. So that's why you would love to be in that line of business. But of course, other people realize that. And so that's why it's a dogfight between JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs and UBS and everything else like that. But ideally, you find a new market where other people don't realize that's the case. And then you sweep in and get that market for yourself. However, as you point out, the world is not perfect. And so you will often be faced with things where you can't monetize as directly as you like. You can't monetize as quickly as you like. You can't monetize in a sustainable way as you would like. And the thing is, you just got to do the best you can and manage those downsides accordingly. So monetizing directly, Facebook can't monetize directly. Facebook started off with college students. College students don't pay for anything unless it's alcohol. And Facebook couldn't just start selling alcohol over the internet. So they had to monetize through advertising. It's not as direct, but it works. The average revenue per user for Facebook is, single-digit dollars per year. It's not a lot. Whereas the average revenue we just heard for JP Morgan Chase private banking was over $100,000 a year. But guess what? When Facebook has a billion users and JP Morgan Chase does not have a billion, multimillionaires paying them, it's actually a bigger business. So you overcome the indirectness, you overcome the relatively small volume by monetizing across a huge number of people, right? Volume and quantity has a quality all its own. But the other thing,
And,
well, go ahead.
no, I was just going to highlight the equation here, which is, powerful people with a really big problem who are monetized, times multiplied by monetizability, multiplied by scale. So how many of them
Yes.
there are.
Yes. And so that's why when people say, well, this is a big market, I'm like, well, there's a large number of potential buyers, but we still have to look at their power, monetizability, and all those other factors involved. So the other thing I was going to say is the time frame involved. So there are two different potential negative timeframes. One is where it's going to take a while for the monetization to happen. This is something that happened with Uber because, as I described to you, they had to subsidize and they weren't making as much money upfront. They're still struggling with this to a certain extent. But then there's also companies like Amazon, where Jeff Bezos was able to modulate over time. So as investors required him to be more profitable, he would make the company more profitable. He would monetize more directly. He would ease up on growth in order to improve monetization. But then once investors were like, oh, we're okay with that, he could then get more aggressive again. So this is something you can actually dial up and dial down, but it really depends on your ability to finance that deficit period. And the more you're able to finance the deficit period, the more you're able to actually move quickly. That's one of the principles of blitzscaling. The final element is the sustainability. We were talking earlier about what happens if you build a debit card for teenagers. How sustainable is it? And the problem is there's a theory behind it. Oh, yes, of course. We'll get them now and they'll stay loyal to us over time. And my response to that is open up your wallet, show me your credit cards, and show me the ones you signed up for in college. And the answer is, well, none of them. All right, well, then this argument is absurd. There's no loyalty here. And so the sustainability is really important. You actually need to say, all right, it's great that I get this revenue stream now, but is it one time? Is it for a couple of years? Or is it something that keeps on going out in time? Again, to come back to private wealth management, rich people get richer. And so it is ideal. You just keep their money with you until either someone else steals them away by maybe by offering them cocaine or what have you, I don't know, or until they die, in which case you hope to get their heirs as customers.
I really liked your example of the debit card or the credit card for teenagers, because it highlights the need to be truly introspective and truly
Yes.
ask yourself if your assumptions are accurate. So if someone is giving you $1 million today, well, they're going to give you $1 million. They already gave it to you, right? Anything that's not that, well, you need some form of data, and the data can be misleading. So I actually use the same bank that I signed up for when I was 10 years old, but it wasn't one of these challenger banks. It's like one of the big established banks in Canada where I'm from, and there's no reason for me to leave because it's just the big thing. If I had signed up for some small, like teen-oriented bank, would I still be using it today? Probably not. I'm sure I did sign up for things like that back then, and I just forgot about them.
Also, a retail banking customer is practically worthless unless they can sell you other products. Because
Right.
again, you don't keep that much money in your bank account typically, at least if you're financially savvy. And so if you're poor, you're worthless. If you're rich, you don't keep your money there. And so it really, the people don't fight that much over the retail banking deposit accounts because they're just not that valuable. You need to have them, but they're not that valuable. However, if that same bank that you signed up for when you're 10 years old also provides your credit cards, also provides your mortgage, also provides your insurance, then they probably are making a lot of money off you. But my question would be, are they doing that?
In my case, yes, but Canada, the Canadian banking system's very. I mean, there's just not that many banks,
Hmm. Well,
so it's
that is
a
interesting.
interesting.
I would just say that it sounds like being a Canadian bank is a good business.
It's they're all becoming. They're eating all the American banks now. So
Well, I am all for increasing Canadianization of America because Canada is, again, it's not perfect, but I really do like Canada quite a bit.
so just a recap here. When you're doing research for a business, you start by looking for problems, and you start by looking for problems for really one group of people.
Yes.
And you need to be looking for people who have a huge problem, who have power and money, and that's power and money, like power and value that's you can monetize realistically, and there needs to be a lot of them.
Yes, or there needs to be, or the product of the value per and the number has to be big. And you can get there via, oh, I'm serving billionaires and I have a lot of them. You can serve, let's call it 1,000 billionaires and be enormously successful. You can serve 1,000,000,000 and be successful, but you can't be successful by serving 1,000 people with $1,000.
And of course, you need other people, stakeholders who have some form of problem that you can solve. But what matters above all else is a single group who are really driving it. So
The one primary driver. Without the one primary driver, the whole equation doesn't work.
thank you so much for this, Chris. It was very helpful to me, and like all this stuff, it's amazing how little content there is, at least I'm aware of, which actually discusses the things that matter in a systematic way. Like, it's just pontification. So anyways, I learned so much. Thank you to our audience who tuned in for the live stream. Thank you to everyone who's just about to hit like and subscribe, mostly like. And thank you to our producing team, Brendan, Jeremy, and Shlok.
Thanks so much, guys. And by the time you see me again, Julien, I will be back from my Hawaiian vacation, hopefully looking tan and relaxed, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Chris.